I just want to make a couple of comments about President's Day. And, who's your favorite president? And this is always an interesting question. And, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. And I'll tell you what, the presidents that we've had, especially this century, in my opinion, not good at all. And so it's interesting to think about, who's the best president. And this is always, you always see these kinds of comments online, and everyone's got an opinion. There's different people that do stack rankings of presidents. And a lot of it's subjective. I mean, there's obviously some very bad presidents that we can all identify. But who's your favorite president? If you have one, list them in the live stream. I'd be interested in knowing. Jason Lee on the live stream says hello. How you doing, Jason? Now, for me, I'm just going to talk about the presidents during my lifetime. Okay. And first president when I was born was LBJ. LBJ, the architect of the Great Society, which, has added layers and layers of additional government bureaucracy and is part of the reason that we find ourselves in a major debt as a nation, in my opinion. Also, someone that was part of the Vietnam War, which I thought was a terrible policy. LBJ is definitely not one of my favorites. Pat Johnson on the live stream chimes in, Abe Lincoln and George Washington, right? Those are, everyone always looks to those two. And actually that's why we have President's Day now, because George Washington's birthday is on February 22nd, which is tomorrow. And Abraham Lincoln's birthday, if I recall, is on February 11th. And when I was a kid, when I was in school, we used to get both of those days off. I don't know if you remember that. We got both days off, and then sometime like in the 70s, they combined them into one and kind of ripped us off. We lost a holiday. We lost a national holiday, and they just call it President's Day now. So Abe Lincoln and George Washington are always looked upon as some of the best presidents. I mean, Abe Lincoln kept the nation together. Abe Lincoln fought a war to free the slaves, although that really wasn't his motivation when he began the war. But partway through the war, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the greatest actions of liberty ever by a president. Abe Lincoln, definitely one of the better ones, but he's got a dark side too. Abe Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which are our rights to trial. I mean, there's a dark side to Abe Lincoln that is often not commented on. I should probably do a podcast about that sometime in the future. Jason Lee says Eisenhower or Roosevelt. I mean, Eisenhower, was he a good granted, the Vietnam War happened under Eisenhower's regime. I mean, there was still a lot of racial unrest during the Eisenhower years. Tax rates were insane during that time frame. I don't know. Eisenhower, to me, doesn't strike me as one of the better presidents. Roosevelt, everyone loves FDR. But man, FDR had internment camps. He locked up Japanese Americans, American citizens of Japanese descent. To me, Roosevelt, also similar to LBJ, an architect of a lot of this insane expansion of government that we're seeing that costs so much and intrudes so much in our life. This podcast is all about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And frankly, a lot of FDR's policies, I don't think match that. Pat Johnson on the live stream says, during my life, Ronald Reagan. Okay, well, now we're getting into the era of presidents during my lifetime. So let me go continue down that list. Oh, and then Pat goes on to say, and then Bill Clinton. So, okay, LBJ is out. Okay, who's after LBJ? Nixon. Okay, you can't love Nixon, right? I mean, obviously, he ramped up the Vietnam War, took us off the gold standard, and of course, there was the Watergate scandal and lots of other things. By the way, I don't know, it's been about 5-6 years ago. I went up to Yorba Linda up in Orange County and had a chance to go to the Nixon Library. That was a really cool visit. If you're into American history and want to learn more about our presidents, I can't recommend that one enough. And again, I'm no Nixon fan, but I loved it. So I'm hoping to get up to the Ronald Reagan Library, which is up in Simi Valley sometime. I think that'd be terrific. Now, I know that there are, it's funny, about 3 or 4 years ago, I went to an Aztec basketball game up at Cal State Fullerton during the Thanksgiving holiday, and they were playing Creighton. And the Aztecs had a great victory. It was a wonderful game. But I was waiting in line with a family, and they said that they came out not only because they were from Nebraska, they were Creighton fans, but they also are on a quest to visit every one of the presidential libraries. And so while they were in Southern California, they were going to go to the Nixon Library and to the Reagan Library. That's actually a pretty cool idea, to go visit all of those. I'm personally working on a project to go visit all of the California missions. And I've got about, I think, 13 out of the 21 done. So I've got 8 more to go. But maybe when I'm finished with that, going to all the presidential libraries, that could be a lot of fun. All right. So after Nixon, there was Ford, right? Ford, didn't do a lot of damage. A lot of people don't like him because of the, because he basically pardoned Nixon, right? Then there's the Carter era, and Carter, wonderful man, but from a historical perspective, people either love him or hate him for a whole long list of reasons. Then there's Reagan. Reagan, his campaigning in 1980 was fabulous, but the way he governed didn't match the way he campaigned. Reagan had all sorts of scandals, all sorts of challenges. H.W. Bush got us into the first Gulf War. And then, Clinton had his issues as well. In my opinion, not a lot of great presidents during my lifetime. Jason Lee on the live stream says, I heard that the tax for the super rich used to be over 80%. That was more than 70 years ago under other presidencies. Yeah, that was actually during Eisenhower. The top marginal rate was as high as 90-something%. Now, that doesn't mean they paid 90% of all their income. It was just that top layer of their total income. But really, if you look at the data back then, the top 1% of America had an effective total tax rate of around 42%, because no one paid 90-something%. And back then, there were so many more deductions. You could write off your interest on your auto loan. You could write off a 3-martini lunch. And that's just, a couple of anecdotal ones. There was a lot more tax shelters, a lot more options to subtract income from, to make your reportable income a lot less. But no one ever paid over 80 or 90%. And if they did, very few did. Pat Johnson goes on, but Reagan was great for the military, and he was. If you were in the military, if you were a defense contractor, boy, Reagan was great because all the spending on the military, and that was part of his strategy to bankrupt the USSR, and frankly, that worked. But I know I'll tell you what. I'm going to tell you who my favorite president was in my lifetime, and it's definitely not Trump. Trump's probably my least favorite. In fact, it seemed like from the 70s down, every president seemed to be worse than the previous one. Bush was worse than Reagan, and I thought Clinton was worse than Bush, and George W. Bush was definitely worse than Clinton, and on down the road. And I think it hit rock bottom with Trump, and now we got Biden, who's just a little bit better, but not much. But really, I think my favorite president in my lifetime, is kind of a controversial choice, but I think it's Carter. And the reason is that, first of all, Carter did very little damage compared to a lot of other presidents. The national debt wasn't blown up. Now, granted, he was dealing with inflation, but a lot of that inflation was caused by some of the actions of Nixon in the early part of the 70s, taking us off the gold standard. And there were a number of other decisions that were made prior to Carter. And then he put in place, the high inflation, the high interest rates, which was able to get inflation under control. And the fruits of that really weren't experienced until Reagan was elected. But the thing that I love about Carter, more so than any other president, is that he was the great deregulator. He deregulated trucking. He deregulated the airline industry that has led to lower prices and more competition. He also deregulated the beer industry. Okay. And this is a great story because um, uh, back in the 70s, there were only about, I don't know, 10 breweries, 20 breweries. There weren't that many. There were just the big ones, right? There was Anheuser-Busch, there was Miller Brewing, there was Coors, and there were probably a handful of others that might have been regional, but there were very few major breweries. Brewing your own beer at home was illegal. And starting up your own beer company was a bureaucratic nightmare. It was extremely difficult because of all the heavy regulations. Well, who benefits when there's very few breweries? Well, of course, the brewers that are still in business. Anheuser-Busch loved the fact that it was illegal to make beer at home, loved the fact that small independent brewers found it so difficult to get started. Carter deregulated the beer industry, and we are way better off as a result, especially here in San Diego County, which is like the microbrew capital of the world. There's so many microbreweries that have started here, that have flourished here, like Stone Brewing and Ballast Point. I mean, there's a long list of brewers here in San Diego County. None of that would ever have been possible without Jimmy Carter. And I commend him for that. So, the Republicans are the ones that usually talk about that we're overregulated. And then what do they end up doing is typically either increasing regulations, or if they decrease them, it's superficial. But the one that really was the great deregulator was a Democrat, and it was Jimmy Carter. So good on him. Jason Lee says, is it the IRD underfunded? I don't know what the IRD is. Missing all the IPA now from Jason. And then Pat Johnson went on to say Clinton was the only modern day president to have the government operating a surplus, not a deficit. That's sort of true. According to the way the government does their bookkeeping, that's true. His final 4 years of his presidency all had surpluses. And the fourth budget year happened where I think W. Bush was this was the 2001 budget that Clinton passed and signed, because that went into effect in October of 2000. And then W was able to preside over much of that budget. That was the fourth of four budgets that Clinton signed with a Republican Congress that had a surplus. But what's interesting is that every year during the Clinton presidency, the national debt went up. So then it makes you wonder, okay, what kind of bookkeeping are they really doing here? Because sure, they had a surplus, but if the debt is going up, then did they really have a surplus? So I think a lot of this goes to accounting methodologies. I've read some articles that said if a corporation operating under standard accounting policies had done their books the same way that the federal government does their books, they would have gotten in trouble. They would have been, dealing with accounting irregularities. And if they were a public company, they could have, been a lot of SEC infractions as a result of that. So, yeah, Clinton, he's, in my opinion, he is less damaging than a lot of the other presidents, right? But to me, he was no saint. One of the things that's interesting is that in the Clinton presidency, he along with the Republican Congress cut capital gains taxes from 28 to 20%. And what happened as a result? We saw a surge of investment, and especially into technology, and that's what really fueled a growing economy, especially in the tech sector. And that's what fueled a lot of the additional revenues into the federal government that allowed them to have a surplus. So a lot of times you'll hear people say that if you cut taxes, you're going to be damaging revenue. Well, in this case, Clinton cut the capital gains tax and had a great result from it. I think that's terrific. Um, Jason Lee says, "Oh, I meant the IRS." So, is the IRS underfunded now? I think they are, and I think that's good because the IRS is just a very intrusive organization, and if they're stretched thin, then fine. They're going to have trouble chasing everyone down. I mean, to me, in a lot of ways, our income tax system is completely unjust, and they're the ones that are out there enforcing it. So, Matthew Brannigan goes on to say, yes, they are underfunded, but I'm not too concerned about that, though. Exactly, Matthew. You and I share the same opinion. So it is President's Day. It's a time to kind of reflect on history. It might be fun to do a podcast episode to rank the presidents in my lifetime and maybe in the 20th century or maybe all time, and what the criteria should be. There are definitely some presidents. If you go back in history, there's other ones that I thought were pretty good that don't get as much attention as they should. Like Calvin Coolidge, I think is a good president. He was a very, in relative terms, a laissez-faire with the economy. And as a result, they saw a booming economy in the 20s. And yeah, the stock market crashed, but a lot of that was because of other government, typically the Fed monkeying around with money supply was part of the reason why the stock market crashed in the late 20s. But anyways, I always thought Calvin Coolidge deserves a lot more credit than he gets.